Hola amigos, bien o no, y saludos desde Medellín. Aquí la lluvia viene, so puede ser un poco corto este video, pero listo. Tema de hoy, ¿por qué es mejor para enfocar primero en escuchando y hablando y solo después leyendo y finalmente escribiendo? Ese es el tema de hoy. So, hello from Medellin, where hopefully we'll get the video done just before the rain gets here. So the theme of the day, why is it more important to start your language practice with listening and speaking, and then finally with reading and ultimately with writing? Well, really, yes, we do need to be able to read and write correctly. That's true. It is a useful skill set, but in the end, I would argue the most useful is communicating. And for most of us, that is still done by speaking. So to help us with speaking, and speaking clearly so the other people can understand us, really this becomes a case, in some ways you could say, of like mimicking. We have to have an example to listen to begin with, so we understand the sound of the new language. Then we have to try and copy that sound by speaking ourselves. And then finally we can bring in elements like reading to give us access to more material. But notice the difference between reading silently to yourself and reading aloud as a way to practice using your voice. Because this is the first thing you will lose in the sense of your fluency. You can be very good at writing things and reading things, and in many cases, if you're in like academic research, you can probably function quite well. Reading texts in foreign languages and even perhaps writing about it as well in that new language. But when it comes to you having to speak to people from that country in their language, if you haven't practiced, you might find that difficult, because the apparent speed at which native speakers speak could be a shock if you're not used to listening to lots of them speak and then being familiar with how they sound. So that's really the thing. When we're looking at balancing the amount of time we spend on each of these elements, because they're all important. I mean, they all have their place. Even as I said, the last one I would put on the list as writing is still a useful skill. You know, you can use that to write down plans for what you're going to do, and clearly it's helpful if you can spell it properly as well. But of course there are now other kind of software that can help you with lots of that. But I would still say that the listening and the speaking have to come first. Probably even as much as 80% of what you do probably should be listening, and then you can reduce the rest back from there. You know, maybe 10% of that should be speaking, and another 8% probably of reading, but also allowing you to read aloud, and a couple of percent on writing, if that. Because especially by listening, you get to hear all the different forms of the language, the different ways people from that country express themselves, how they sound. So when you meet them in person, it's less of a shock. You then have a chance of imitating their rhythm and intonation of speech. So when you speak back to them, you sound more like them. Not so much copy their accent perhaps, but at least have the same type of intonation and modulation of speech, which is the thing that really they're listening for. So use the listening as a guide to help you absorb new vocabulary, it's true, but also to use it as a model for your speaking, which you can then gain more material from by reading aloud, and then finally by reading silently and researching, maybe taking notes writing in the language, again, you're helping reinforce that. But those last two, reading silently and writing, is probably something just to do as a way of helping you reinforce your memory of particular vocabulary. But I would certainly start with listening to lots of things. It's a very easy thing to do. Put on the podcast, or listen to your videos in YouTube. Don't worry about it if you can't watch them. Just listen to them as though they're a podcast. Then you can do that while you're doing your other tasks, during the day. And then when you're practicing studying, either speak along with that kind of shadowing technique we've talked about earlier, where you listen to a line of dialogue and then practice that yourself as you're listening along to the person speak, or again, as I often say, reading aloud. Very, very useful. So there we are. That's my thought for the day. When you're planning out your studies in the new language, think about that. Make sure you have an overwhelming majority of your time on listening and speaking, and then the other elements like reading silently and writing, I would keep that as a very minimal part of it. So, I hope you find this one useful. Déjame saber en los comentarios, como siempre. But for now, from Medellin, before the rain gets here, we'll say cheerio.